Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Economic tremors are shaking global markets as President Donald Trump activates a new reciprocal tariffs of up to 41% on goods imported from over 60 countries, from Brazil to Switzerland, India to the European Union. The president cited emergency powers, which he says he is using to shrink the country's trade deficits with many of its trade partners. The move has sparked international concern, legal battles and urgent diplomatic efforts, with chips, pharma and geopolitics all at play. There's lots to unpack. Joining us to analyse the chaos and help us understand what comes next is Tomasz Włostowski, Managing Partner, EU Strategies and a regular guest. Tomasz, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time. I know you're travelling a lot at the moment. Okay, so suddenly, well, I suppose relatively suddenly, these additional tariffs are slapped on to about 60 countries by President Trump. Now, are these tariffs designed to even out the trade balance between the two countries? Are they punitive tariffs? Are they secondary tariffs for countries that are doing business with Russia? What are we to make of these?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of elements to these tariffs. I think the secondary sanctions, I think we can put to the side because that's sort of a different topic that relates to the sort of Russian war in Ukraine and Trump's attempts to somehow achieve peace there. But as for the reciprocal tariffs, some of them are clearly punitive. For example, the tariffs on Brazil and some other countries, that they're obviously punitive. In general, their main purpose, as Trump says, is basically to bring production and manufacturing back to the United States. It's quite clear, I think, that Trump really envisions a world in which U.S. has quite high tariffs for some time in the future. So there have been some attempts to explain what Trump is doing as a sort of negotiation tactic for him to have some leverage over his trading partners. But I think at this point it's quite clear the tariffs are going to stay. He can bring them down a little bit, but the United States is going to have quite high tariffs, about 15%, 20%, 30% on a bunch of countries. So that's, of course, is going to raise a lot of economic problems in the United States in the long term. But, to your question, are they punitive? Are they reciprocal? What are they? There is no singular answer, basically. They're definitely not reciprocal because they are, quite higher than most states have on the United States. There was no real attempt in quantifying the non-tariff barriers that Trump claims the reciprocal tariffs are meant to address. So, in some ways they're punitive, in other ways they're sort of the minimum tariffs he could impose without sparking some major trade war with his partners. So basically it's the minimum that the countries or the maximum that the other countries could accept.
So basically it's a broad brush approach and has multiple impacts. Let's start with trading partners. What's their response? For example, I was reading an article about the Swiss watch industry, and 17% of all Swiss watches go to the United States. And manufacturers of these Swiss watches are saying, well, we're not going to take the hit. We're just going to put the prices up on customers in the US. What's going to happen to companies or industry sectors like that in different countries?
Well, look, there are two elements to it, right? So one, of course, the big sort of corporations, the ones that can sort of afford to move their production or juggle between different production sites, they can sort of use the arbitrage to say, well, if we can ship from China, maybe we're going to ship from India. And if the tariffs for India are high, as they seem to be right now because of secondary tariffs you mentioned, maybe we're going to be shipping from some other countries. So some corporations, can use their vast sort of global chains to try to address it. But, definitely at the end of the day, the prices in the US are going to go up because the corporations right now are a bit afraid to increase prices because they're basically afraid to receive President Trump's sort of revenge. But sooner or later, economics are going to kick in and they will have to be raising prices, and the American importers and the American customers and American industry is going to end up paying for them. Of course, at the same time, the US is a huge market. So for a lot of companies, this is a massive, massive loss. And of course, on the one hand, they will try to pass on the cost to their consumers, but on the other hand, that is, of course, is always going to bring down their sales in the United States, so that it will affect their bottom line. So it is not something they can easily deal with, basically.
Right. Okay. Now, clearly, part of Donald Trump's ambition is to get more companies manufacturing in the United States, and we're talking about chips in particular. Does this have a geopolitical component, getting chip manufacture away from places like Taiwan, a world leader in chip manufacturing, away from Chinese influence?
Well, there's obviously an element of that. I mean, there are two parts to it, right? One, of course, is the element of bringing back manufacturing. And that, of course, I think it permeates everything that Trump is doing. I mean, that is, I think that if we were to look for the number one reason he's doing it, he says that's it, to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Of course, in reality, that requires quite a sophisticated analysis of how to do that. Nobody's going to bring back manufacturing in 3.5 years. That's the rest of Trump's term. It takes a lot of time to bring manufacturing back, to set up production facilities, to establish new supply chains, and so on. That's number one. Number two, of course, you cannot impose tariffs on everybody and everything, and then expect manufacturing to somehow, magically show up in the United States, because, of course, manufacturing appears usually where there is a consumer market for it, which America obviously has, but also where there is competitive advantage to produce things. So if you can't at the same time impose tariffs on cars, for example, and steel and aluminum, and expect American car manufacturers to thrive, because their input costs have just risen dramatically, right? So that requires a much more sophisticated analysis than the U.S. administration, gave it. And basically, those tariffs, again, they will not only increase prices in the United States, but they will also eventually increase manufacturing production costs, and therefore prices again.
Understood. Now, there are some bright spots. The European Union, for example, has remained largely untouched. The 15% that was agreed recently between the EU and the US remains the same. Why is it that the EU was left out of this?
Well, I think I would disagree that the tariffs on EU are small, and that they were left out. I mean, the EU. Let's recall, the EU is one of the main trading partners of the United States. Depending how you count Mexico and Canada, if you count them together or not, if you don't count them together, the EU is the largest trading partner of the EU. Right? Our trade is somewhere about 1.6 trillion. I mean, that is just a mind-blowing value if you think about it. It's 4 billion a day of exchange. I mean, that is just an incredible amount. So the EU, of course, was always a special case. But the 15% tariff on EU exports to the EU, to the US, that's a massive increase. It doesn't sound large compared to 40% on 35%, but let's keep in mind that a 40% tariff on some of the other countries, that's like a prohibitive tariff. I mean, that just basically says that the trade is going to stop with those countries. A 15% tariff is going to allow trade to continue, but it is still very, very high, and is not something the EU is happy about. So that's sort of number one. Number two, of course, I think most trading partners are basically thinking how to address this in the long term, and how to get these tariffs lower. Nobody wants to be paying even 15% tariff or 20% tariffs or 25% tariffs. So I think what most trading partners of the United States are doing, and definitely the EU is doing it, they're trying to accommodate President Trump for now, but they're also thinking at the same time, well, how can we readdress this issue? How can we reopen these negotiations? How can we still bring it down, especially given that so much is still left unclear? Because these deals that President Trump is making with everybody are basically very general, and they're lacking a lot of detail. And whenever there is an agreement that doesn't have any detail, that's a potential for future dispute.
Understood. However, that said, Ursula von der Leyen, in the press conference that she held with Donald Trump, said that this was an evening up, a levelling out of tariffs, and she was implying that it was fair. Your thoughts on her comments there? Were they simply political rhetoric?
Well, this was obviously political rhetoric. The EU delegation, not only the president of the European Commission, but also the EU Trade Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, I'm thinking how to phrase this properly on public TV, but they received a beating in public relations, basically, in Brussels for the way these negotiations ended up. Ursula von der Leyen sat next to President Trump, quietly trying not to contradict him, while he said things that were obviously untrue. And the thing you just brought up, that is just patently not true. This is not leveling off sort of the trade relationship between the EU and the US. EU tariffs are very, very low, sort of globally speaking. It depends how you count them. Is it a weighted average? Are you doing manufactured products, agricultural products? So there are different ways to look at it. But basically, EU tariffs are very, very low. So the notion that if the US imposes 15% tariffs on EU exports, that somehow levels the relationship, that's just patently not true. And the only way to interpret what Ursula von der Leyen did, she did it because she did not want to create a major sort of confrontation in front of cameras as they were rolling their press conference.
So a diplomatic response. I want to go now to the Fear and Greed Index. As you know, it's an index of how nervous the stock market generally feels on the release of economic news, and that stayed fairly neutral despite what seemed like swinging tariffs. Why is that? Does that surprise you?
It did surprise me, but I think the stock market basically is underplaying the potential for all of this to go wrong, and they usually react in the last possible moment. Maybe there's a reason from an investment standpoint, but in general, the markets are under appreciating, I think, the risk of a global confrontation that we're facing. That's number two, and number three. One of the big issues is that this is not the end of the story. And I think most investors understand it. This is one episode in a very long series that's going to have 20 seasons. So today we have a deal. In a week we're going to have some dispute about one part of the deal. There's going to be a big conflagration in a month. We're going to have another deal, and so on. And this is how Trump's presidency is going to roll. I don't think anybody expects this trade war to go away at this point, and it's just going to be a continued sort of series of news, deals, agreements, disputes, some misunderstandings about how these agreements with Trump are being implemented in the United States, and so on.
Understood. Unfortunately, Tomasz, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you, as always, for sharing your analysis with our audience. Come and do more of this as things develop. Have a good evening, sir.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.